It was an ordinary evening, the kind where the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. Chris sat at his cluttered desk in his modest apartment. The hum of his old laptop, his only companion as he worked late into the night. Papers, old maps, and ancient texts littered the surface in front of him, remnants of his latest research. As an archaeologist, Chris had spent years chasing stories of lost civilizations and ancient ruins. But so far, most of them had led to dead ends. The excitement of unearthing new findings had slowly worn off, replaced by the harsh reality that true discoveries were rare and hard-won. But tonight, as he sifted through old photographs and notes from his previous expeditions, something caught his eye. A peculiar envelope that had been slipped under his door. It was different from the usual junk mail or bills. The envelope was old, the edges tattered, as though it had traveled far across time. The paper was yellowed, and a deep red wax seal adorned the back, emblazoned with a symbol Chris couldn't quite recognize. The wax was still intact, adding to the mystery, as if whoever sent it had wanted to ensure it arrived undisturbed. Curious, Chris carefully pried the seal open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in elegant yet slightly faded ink. The message was brief, almost cryptic, but it carried an air of urgency. It read, "The truth lies beneath the soil of Brazil's forgotten village." Chris stared at the letter, confusion flooding his mind. Brazil? Forgotten village? He had heard countless stories about Brazil's hidden secrets, but none that directly mentioned a forgotten village. He turned the paper over, but there was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it. Just the message. The more he stared at it, the more his curiosity grew, and a spark of excitement flickered within him. This was something he couldn't ignore. Without wasting any time, Chris picked up his phone and called his team. He had worked with them for years, a small but dedicated group of archaeologists and explorers, each with their own area of expertise. There was Sarah, a brilliant historian with a passion for ancient cultures, always ready to dive into the past and uncover its secrets. And then there was Jake, a tech-savvy geologist who could map out terrain and find hidden locations with ease. Finally, there was Mark, a seasoned explorer whose experience in harsh conditions made him indispensable. Chris dialed Sarah's number first. She picked up almost immediately. "Hey, Sarah, it's Chris. You won't believe what just happened." "Is everything all right? You sound excited," she responded, her voice tinged with concern. "I just received the strangest letter. It's from someone in Brazil," Chris began, feeling the excitement in his voice grow. "It's about a forgotten village. They say the truth lies beneath the soil there. We need to go. This could be the discovery of a lifetime." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Brazil? A forgotten village? That's interesting, to say the least. Do you have any more details?" "No, nothing. Just that message. But I think we have to investigate." "I'm calling Mark and Jake now. I think we have a lead, Sarah. This could be huge." Chris ended the call and immediately dialed Mark. His tone was more urgent now, and he felt the thrill of anticipation rise in his chest. Mark, always the skeptic, answered with his usual dry. Chris laughed, but he quickly got to the point. "Mark, listen. I got a letter today. It's from Brazil. They're talking about a forgotten village, and there's something buried beneath it. I think it's worth investigating. We need to go." Mark's tone shifted. "A forgotten village, you say? That sounds pretty interesting, actually. I'll pack my gear." With that, Chris quickly reached out to Jake, who was always the first to volunteer for any adventure, no matter how dangerous. "Jake, I need you on this one. We've got a lead in Brazil. There's a forgotten village, and we have to check it out. I'm going to need your expertise with terrain mapping." Jake's response was immediate, as expected. "Brazil? Sounds perfect. Count me in. Let's get this thing rolling." With his team on board, Chris felt a rush of adrenaline. He hadn't felt this excited in years. Brazil, the land of the Amazon rainforest, ancient tribes, and untold secrets, was calling. What could this forgotten village hold? Who had sent the letter, and why? So many questions lingered in his mind, but he pushed them aside. For now, the only thing that mattered was that they were going. The mystery was too great to pass up. The next few days were a blur of preparation. They gathered their equipment: maps, cameras, survival gear, and a variety of tools for digging and examining artifacts. Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of destiny pulling him toward this unknown adventure. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this was no coincidence. Something important was waiting for them in the heart of Brazil, something that had been hidden for centuries. Finally, the team boarded a plane bound for Brazil. The flight was long, but the excitement kept them all on edge. They had no solid plan beyond the message in the letter, no exact coordinates to guide them. But they all felt that the journey was meant to be. They would follow the clues and see where it led them. When they arrived in Brazil, the heat hit them immediately. The humid air of the Amazon jungle was thick, and the scent of damp earth and vegetation filled their nostrils. They made their way into the heart of the jungle, armed with nothing but their instincts and the message Chris had received. The roads quickly became dirt paths, and then those disappeared altogether. They had to rely on their knowledge of survival and exploration as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. As they trekked through the jungle, they couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that surrounded them. The usual sounds of birds and animals were absent, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unnatural. It was as if the very jungle was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We're getting close," Jake said, pulling out his mapping equipment to check their position. "According to the readings, we should be near the village, but something doesn't feel right." Chris nodded. He could feel it too, the tension in the air, the weight of the unknown. It was as if something was watching them, waiting. They pressed on, determined to find the village mentioned in the letter. But none of them knew that what awaited them in the heart of Brazil was far darker and more dangerous than they could have imagined. They were about to uncover a secret that had been buried beneath the soil for centuries. And they would soon learn that some truths are better left forgotten. What began as an exciting adventure would soon turn into a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And so, their journey into the unknown began, with only the mysterious letter to guide them, and the chilling feeling that something or someone was waiting in the shadows. As the night fell, They set up camp near a small clearing, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The plane touched down in Brazil early in the morning, its wheels hitting the tarmac with a slight jolt. Chris stepped off, taking in the heavy air. The jungle was just beyond the runway, vast and uninviting. He could already feel the weight of the humidity pressing down on him. The jungle, Amazonia, was alive in ways he hadn't yet understood. A place where nature ruled unchallenged, and human presence was an intrusion. As he took a deep breath, the thick, damp air seemed to fill his lungs, and the heat wrapped around him like a blanket. It was different here, in the heart of Brazil. Raw, unforgiving. His team gathered their gear, checking the supplies and making last-minute adjustments before heading out. The airport seemed like a distant memory already, as if the outside world had vanished the moment they stepped into the jungle. Chris could feel a surge of excitement as they piled into a rickety van that would take them into the heart of the Amazon. Mark, ever the skeptic, made some dry comment about the conditions, his face scrunched in disapproval. "I don't know why they didn't give us an air-conditioned car for this. It's going to be brutal." Jake, who had been fiddling with his equipment, glanced up and smirked. "You know, the deeper we go, the less modern the world is going to get. By the time we reach that village, we'll be lucky if we have a flashlight, let alone air conditioning." Sarah, walking beside Chris, was silent, lost in thought. She had the look of someone on the brink of excitement, mixed with apprehension. Sarah always had a way of seeing the world through an ancient lens, and Chris could tell she felt the weight of this place. There was something different about this expedition, something that felt more like a pilgrimage than a simple journey of discovery. She glanced at him, and without speaking, he knew she was feeling the same pull. The allure of uncovering something buried, something hidden beneath the soil of Brazil, for reasons they couldn't yet fathom. The further they traveled into the jungle, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The road, such as it was, quickly became a narrow dirt path. The van bumped and swayed, fighting the uneven terrain as the jungle closed in around them. Trees towered overhead, their thick foliage blocking out most of the sunlight, casting them into a perpetual twilight. The noise of the jungle surrounded them, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant animals, and the faint hum of unseen insects. But as they continued, something began to shift. The sounds didn't seem right. They weren't the natural rhythms of the jungle they expected. Chris couldn't help but notice how quiet it had gotten. There was a weight to the air now, something oppressive, something waiting. The deeper they went, the more the air felt heavy, as if it was thick with secrets. Every turn of the path, every rustle in the trees seemed to carry a warning, though Chris couldn't quite figure out what that warning was. His mind kept returning to the cryptic message in the letter. The truth lies beneath the soil of Brazil's forgotten village. What truth? And why had someone sent them here? It was as though they were being drawn into something ancient, something that had been waiting a long time for them to find it. By the time they arrived at the outskirts of the village, the sun was beginning to set. The light filtered through the thick canopy, casting everything in an eerie golden glow. They set up camp near a small stream, which would provide fresh water for the night. As Chris unpacked his things, he noticed how still everything was. No birds sang. No animals moved. There was an unnatural quiet surrounding them. Only the occasional sound of leaves rustling under the faint breeze broke the silence. As the night drew closer, the jungle's usual chorus began to emerge. The sounds of insects, frogs, and distant animals calling out in the darkness. Yet there was something about these sounds that felt different. They seemed more insistent, more desperate. There were noises in the underbrush that didn't belong. Chris brushed it off, chalking it up to the dense jungle, the way the environment had its own peculiar rhythms. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. They sat around the campfire, eating a simple meal and talking quietly. The fire crackled, its orange light flickering against the growing shadows. But as they ate, Chris noticed Sarah's attention seemed to drift, her eyes flickering constantly toward the edges of the camp. He saw her bite her lip, her expression tightening. "Sarah, are you okay?" Chris asked, his voice breaking through the low murmur of the others. She looked at him sharply, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Chris frowned, leaning in slightly to listen. "What?" "That sound. It's like footsteps, and they're getting closer," she whispered, her voice tight. Chris sat up straighter, his senses suddenly alert. He could hear the rustling too now, but it wasn't like the usual noise of the jungle animals. It was deliberate, paced. It almost sounded like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the firelight, in the dark. "Stop messing around, Sarah," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "It's probably just the wind. The jungle's full of noises, relax." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "I swear, I heard footsteps, right there, in the shadows." Chris stood up, scanning the darkness. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. Mark was right. It was probably just the wind, but the way Sarah had said it, there was a certain urgency in her voice, a certain weight that he couldn't ignore. "Sarah, relax," Chris said, trying to reassure her, but even as he spoke, a shiver of doubt ran through him. The air was too thick, the jungle too quiet, and the feeling of being watched was too real. They settled back into their camp, trying to shake off the discomfort that lingered in the air. The fire crackled louder, and the sounds of the jungle filled the silence again. But for Chris, the unease didn't go away. As the night wore on, he sat there, staring into the fire, listening to the jungle. The rustling continued, now seeming to echo around them, as if the jungle itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. Around midnight, as the team lay in their tents, Chris couldn't sleep. The noise outside had only grown louder, and it felt like the walls of the jungle were closing in on them. He lay wide awake in his tent, trying to convince himself. The next morning, Sarah was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I didn't sleep a wink," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was something out there, Chris. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was like it was right next to me, watching me." Chris didn't know what to say. He wanted to reassure her, but the truth was, he felt it too. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, wasn't something you could easily ignore. They all felt it now, this oppressive presence in the jungle, something ancient, and watching them from the shadows. But the mission had to continue. They couldn't turn back now. They would press on, deeper into the jungle, closer to the forgotten village. But Chris couldn't help wondering, What were they really walking into? What lay beneath the soil of that ancient village? And why did it feel like they were being drawn there, like the jungle itself was pushing them towards some unknown, terrible fate? The journey into the unknown had begun, but little did they know, the real horrors were still waiting, buried beneath the soil, waiting to be unearthed. The fourth day in the jungle felt like an eternity. Every step they took seemed to carry them deeper into a world that was no longer familiar, a world that felt ancient, untouched, and forgotten by time itself. The air was thick with humidity, and the constant rustling of leaves seemed to whisper around them, the noise carrying the weight of secrets that had been buried for centuries. Their excitement was tempered by the palpable tension that hung in the air, an uneasy feeling that had been growing since they first entered this forsaken land. It was during the early hours of the morning, when the sun was barely breaking through the thick canopy above, that they found it, an ancient stone archway, half covered in moss and vines, marking the entrance to something far older than anything they had encountered so far. The archway stood like a sentinel, its once sturdy stones cracked and weathered, standing in stark contrast to the surrounding jungle. The carvings that adorned the archway, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed faded and eerie, as though time itself had tried to erase their existence. But there was no mistaking the significance of this place. They had found the forgotten village. "This is incredible," Chris murmured, stepping closer to the arch. "I've never seen anything like this before." Sarah, who had been walking a few paces behind him, caught up and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was shaky, a mixture of awe and dread. "What happened to the people who lived here?" Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped through the archway, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The village beyond was in ruins. The once thriving settlement had long since been abandoned, its inhabitants lost to the ages. Dilapidated huts, their roofs sagging and walls crumbling, dotted the clearing. The remnants of what once were homes now stood as hollow shells, their interiors dark and empty. The air around them seemed heavy with the ghosts of the past. The kind of silence that only comes from places untouched for centuries. Ah, the kind of silence that only comes from places untouched for centuries. The team moved cautiously through the village, stepping carefully over the cracked stones and fallen beams that littered the ground. The scent of rotting wood and decaying leaves filled the air. As they walked, Chris couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up his spine. There was something unnatural about this place, something that didn't sit right. The jungle, which had been alive with noise and movement just moments before, now seemed eerily still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Sarah walked ahead, her eyes scanning the village with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. She stopped suddenly, her hand hovering over one of the stone walls of a hut. "Look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These symbols, they're not like anything I've seen before." The carvings were intricate, spiraling patterns that seemed to twist and writhe across the walls. Some of the symbols were recognizable, ancient runes that Sarah had studied in the past, but others were foreign, their meanings lost to time. It was clear that whoever had lived here had been part of something far older, a culture that had long since vanished. The symbols seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though they were alive in their own way. Mark, who had been trailing behind, stepped forward to join Sarah. "These look like ritualistic markings," he said, squatting down to examine them more closely. "But I've never seen anything quite like this. It's like they were trying to communicate something important." The air around them grew colder as they continued to explore, and Chris could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on them, and it seemed to grow more intense with every step they took deeper into the village. The strange energy in the air felt like a warning, as though something was watching them, waiting for them to discover whatever it was that had been buried here. After what felt like hours, they came across a clearing in the center of the village. At its heart was a large stone altar, worn and covered in moss, with a shrine hidden behind it. The shrine was small, but its significance was unmistakable. It was decorated with carvings of black widow spiders, their legs stretched wide, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. The spiders seemed to crawl across the stones, their beady eyes staring back at them from every angle. The air around the shrine was unnaturally cold, the temperature dropping several degrees as they approached. This isn't just a shrine," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is something else. This is where they performed rituals." Chris stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the shrine. There was an undeniable pull to it, an allure that he couldn't explain. It was as if the shrine itself was calling to them, drawing them in, urging them to uncover its secrets. But as he reached out to touch the stone, he hesitated. There was something dark about it, something he couldn't quite understand, and a gut instinct told him that disturbing it could lead to consequences they wouldn't be able to undo. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a crack, followed by a rustling sound behind them. It came from the thick jungle surrounding the village. Everyone turned, their eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. No animals, no movement, just the wind and the rustling of the leaves. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice low and uneasy. He scanned the area, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. "It's nothing," Chris said, his voice tight. "Probably just an animal. Let's keep moving." But as they turned back to the shrine, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, as though the very earth beneath their feet was alive, watching them. The ground seemed to pulse, a faint tremor running through the soil, like something was stirring beneath them. It was subtle at first, but as they took another step forward, the pulsing grew stronger, as if the village itself was awakening after centuries of slumber. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "This place, it's not right. It's like it's alive." Chris could feel it too now, the strange energy growing stronger, pulling at him. He had studied ancient cultures, lost civilizations, and forgotten tribes, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this place. The dark presence that seemed to linger in the air. They had crossed some kind of threshold, and the village was no longer just a relic of the past. It had become something else, something far darker. As they stood there, a distant, low growl echoed through the trees. It was guttural, deep, and unsettling, sending a shiver down their spines. The sound was followed by another, closer this time, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. But when they turned to look, there was no one there, just the wind rustling through the leaves. "Let's go," Chris said, his voice sharp. "Now." They turned to leave, but as they walked away from the shrine, the ground beneath them seemed to shift again, and a sense of dread washed over them. It was as if something had awoken in the village, something ancient and angry, and it was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. The air was thick with tension, and as they moved toward the edge of the village, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something was out there, in the shadows, just beyond their sight, and it was waiting for them to uncover the truth. But as the ground pulsed beneath their feet, they realized that the truth they were seeking might be more terrifying than anything they had imagined. And they had only just begun to scratch the surface of the horrors that lay beneath the soil of this forgotten village. And night was a blur of unease and growing tension. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced like spirits in the darkness. The jungle outside the camp was alive with its usual chorus of sounds: rustling leaves, chirping insects, and the occasional howl of distant creatures. But there was an unsettling undercurrent to it all. It felt as though the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick, and even the most minor sounds seemed to carry an unnatural weight. No one spoke much as they sat around the fire, their faces lit by the dim orange glow. It wasn't until they went to sleep that the real horror began. Chris lay in his tent, staring into the darkness, trying to will himself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, images flickered in his mind. Strange visions of black widow spiders crawling from the earth. Their legs long and sinuous, their bodies bloated and dark. In the vision, the spiders were not mere creatures, but something far darker, something powerful, watching from below the ground, waiting to emerge. With every twitch of his eyelids, Chris saw flashes of twisted bodies being dragged into the earth, their screams muffled by the thick soil. He heard whispers, low and guttural, in a language he didn't recognize, an ancient tongue, forgotten by time. The words felt familiar, like a distant echo from another life, but they were twisted and foreign. Foreign enough to make his skin crawl. When he finally managed to fall asleep, the nightmares only grew worse. The dreams were vivid, too vivid. In one, Sarah, the always calm and composed member of the team, was standing by the shrine, her body rigid and stiff, as if held by some unseen force. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. And then from beneath the ground, a black widow spider the size of a man's torso emerged, its eyes glowing red. It slithered toward her, its fangs dripping with venom. And just as it was about to strike, Sarah's body was pulled into the earth with an audible crack. Chris tried to reach her, but his limbs were frozen, his body unable to move. He screamed her name, but it was too late. When he woke, his heart was racing, his breath short. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and the chill of the night had left him shivering. He tried to shake off the dream, convincing himself it was just the stress of the journey. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. He wasn't the only one affected. Sarah looked pale when they met up at dawn, her eyes hollow, like she hadn't slept at all. There was a haunted look on her face, the same one that had been creeping into the others' expressions during the night. "I had the strangest dream," Sarah whispered, sitting beside Chris as the others began to gather their things. "I saw spiders, thousands of them, crawling from the earth, and they were coming for me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. It was like I was already dead." Chris nodded, his mind still foggy from his own nightmare. "I saw it too," he admitted. "But it wasn't just the spiders. There was something darker, like the village itself was alive, and it was waking up." Sarah shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "I don't know what's happening here, but I don't think we're supposed to be here. Not anymore." Their unease only grew as they began to pack up camp. There was a heaviness in the air, something that clung to them as they walked back into the village. The silence was thick, oppressive, like the village itself was holding its breath. The trees around them loomed like silent sentinels, watching with unseen eyes. As they approached the stone archway that marked the entrance, they noticed something strange. The carvings on the stone were different now, more vivid, more detailed. The spider symbols that had once seemed faded and worn now looked freshly carved, their eyes glowing with an unsettling red hue. It was as if the village had shifted overnight, as if it had come alive with an ancient, hungry energy. By the time they reached the shrine, panic had already begun to set in. The team's nerves were frayed, and their footsteps quickened, driven by an instinctual need to escape. But as they reached the altar, something caught Chris's eye, a shape in the dirt, half hidden by the shadows. It was small, almost insignificant, but something about it drew him in. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and knelt down. It was a stone slab, cracked in places, but still mostly intact. He could just make out the faint outlines of symbols etched into its surface. A chill ran through him as he realized what they were. Symbols similar to those carved into the shrine and the archway. But these were different. These were deeper, more intricate, as though they had been carved with purpose, with intent. There was something dark about them, something that felt like it shouldn't be touched. Without thinking, Chris ran his fingers over the stone. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the clearing, and for a moment, everything felt wrong. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very land beneath their feet was reacting to his touch. And then the ground trembled. It started as a low rumble, so faint they almost didn't notice it. Then it grew louder, shaking the ground beneath them. The air seemed to pulse with energy, as though something was waking up from deep within the earth. Chris stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. But it was too late. As they began to back away, the earth beneath their feet shifted violently. A loud cracking sound echoed through the village, and Chris felt the ground tremble beneath him once more. Then, without warning, the earth gave way. A large section of the ground in front of the shrine collapsed, revealing a deep pit, its edges lined with jagged rocks. The pit seemed to go on forever, its bottom lost in darkness. The tremors continued, and Chris stumbled back, horrified by what lay before him. It wasn't just a pit, it was a tomb. With shaking hands, They approached the edge of the pit, and as they peered down into the darkness, they saw something that sent a chill down their spines. Old bones, scattered and twisted in unnatural shapes. Some were human, others animal, but all were arranged in a manner that suggested ritualistic sacrifice. The bones seemed to glow faintly, as though something from deep within the earth was pulling at them, tugging them toward the pit. Chris's stomach twisted in revulsion as he realized the truth. This village hadn't been abandoned by choice. It had been forsaken because of something far worse. A curse. A curse that had been buried for centuries, waiting for someone to wake it. And they had just done that. The Black Widow, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The spirit. The one they worshipped. It's real. Chris turned to her, his face pale. The Black Widow, the ancient spirit from the village's past, the one they believed could bring them power and protection. But it was clear now. The villagers hadn't been worshipping the Black Widow for protection. They had been offering sacrifices, feeding the spirit in exchange for something far darker, far more terrifying. And now, the spirit had returned. It was awake. Suddenly, they heard a sound, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was walking toward them from the depths of the pit. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the earth that was shaking. It was something else, something far more sinister. The Black Widow was coming. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the once vibrant jungle of Brazil transformed into a shadowy, suffocating expanse. The team gathered their belongings, their faces etched with the kind of fear that only comes when you know something dreadful is lurking just beyond your perception. The air felt thicker now, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Each rustle in the trees, each distant growl seemed amplified, carrying with it an eerie sense of anticipation. "We need to leave now," Chris said, his voice strained. The pit they had uncovered, the bones twisted in grotesque formations, and the cold, unyielding presence of the Black Widow's curse had rattled him to his core. He could feel the pulse of the village beneath his feet, as if the land itself was alive, aware of their every move. They had stirred something ancient, and it was awake. The team set off, determined to retrace their steps, to find their way out of the jungle. But the more they walked, the more the path seemed to vanish. The jungle closed in around them, its massive trees twisting and bending, as if deliberately blocking their way. It was as though the jungle itself had become an entity, intent on keeping them from leaving. The faint glow of their flashlights barely illuminated the way, swallowed up by the darkness that stretched before them like an endless abyss. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice cracking with unease as he glanced over his shoulder. "We were just here. The path was clear." Chris squinted into the dark, his stomach sinking. "It's like the jungle is shifting, changing, like we're not supposed to leave." Sarah, her eyes wide with fear, shook her head. No, something's wrong. This is not natural. We're being trapped." And then, as though the very jungle responded to her words, a cold wind swept through the trees, howling like a distant scream. The team froze. They turned, looking at each other, their expressions taut with horror. There was something in the wind, something chilling, something ancient and relentless. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, moving with an unnerving fluidity. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it drew closer, they could make out its shape. Humanoid, but wrong. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its limbs too long, its presence too vast. It wasn't human. Then they saw her eyes, red, glowing, like twin embers burning in the night. They were the only thing visible on her face. 2 points of fierce light in the darkness, watching them, studying them. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what they were facing. The Black Widow. "Run," he shouted, but the words felt hollow. A futile attempt against the overwhelming terror that gripped them. The team turned and fled, their feet pounding the earth. But the jungle seemed to twist in every direction, the path shifting and changing, like a maze with no exit. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, its very texture alive with an otherworldly energy. Every time they thought they were heading in the right direction, the trees seemed to close in, pushing them deeper into the heart of the jungle. And all the while, the Black Widow pursued them. Her movements were swift and fluid, her figure elongating with every stride. It was as if she was floating, her long limbs stretching unnaturally, her body moving with a terrifying speed. The ground beneath them trembled with every step she took, as though the earth itself quivered in fear. Chris glanced over his shoulder, and his heart skipped a beat. The Black Widow was gaining on them, her eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. She wasn't just chasing them. She was toying with them, a predator savoring the thrill of the hunt. Her whispers echoed in their minds, filling their heads with the promise of death. The sound was chilling, like the rustling of 1,000 spiders crawling beneath their skin. "Keep moving," Chris urged, pushing the others forward. He could feel the weight of her presence, closing in like a storm, relentless and inevitable. They ran, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding. But the jungle refused to relent. The trees seemed to shift with every step, the underbrush closing in, preventing them from escaping. Every corner they turned, every path they took led them right back into the heart of the village, into the waiting arms of the Black Widow. Panic began to set in, fear consuming their every thought. They couldn't outrun her. She was everywhere, her presence suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The jungle, once a place of adventure and discovery, had turned into a trap, and they were the prey. "Chris!" Sarah's voice cracked, and when Chris turned to look at her, he saw that she was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't escape. We're trapped. We need to stop running." But Chris couldn't stop running. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep moving, to keep fighting. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they pushed, the Black Widow was always one step ahead, her red eyes burning brighter with each passing moment. Then, just as he thought they had reached a dead end, the jungle seemed to part, revealing a clearing in the distance. Chris's heart leapt. It was a chance, an opening, a way out. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the clearing, urging the others to follow. But when they stepped into the clearing, the ground trembled again. The trees behind them shuddered, and the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. And then, from the shadows, the Black Widow appeared. This time, she was closer. Much closer. Chris froze, the Black Widow's figure loomed over them, her tall form casting a long shadow in the clearing. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever, and she was no longer moving with fluid grace. No, now she was standing still, watching them, savoring their fear. With every breath they took, the jungle seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, as if the very air was alive with the presence of the Black Widow. Chris could feel it in his bones now. The curse was real. The Black Widow wasn't just a spirit. She was a force of nature. A vengeful ancient entity whose power had been bound to the land for centuries. She was not just a myth. She was a living, breathing manifestation of darkness and death. And now, she had come to collect her due. "You cannot escape," the Black Widow's voice echoed, though her lips never moved. It was a whisper in their minds, a cold, dark promise. "You woke me, and now you will pay the price." Chris's blood ran cold, as the ground beneath them seemed to tremble in response to her words. The jungle was alive with her power now, the trees groaning and shaking, as though they were bowing to her will. The Black Widow took a step forward, and the ground seemed to crack beneath her feet. Every movement she made sent waves of energy through the air, ripples of fear and death that made the very soil shudder. Chris turned to the others, desperation clawing at him. "We have to fight! We can't let her take us!" But deep down, he knew it was hopeless. The Black Widow was more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. She wasn't just a spirit. She was the embodiment of an ancient curse, an unholy force that had been waiting for centuries to be unleashed. And now, it had come for them. The jungle was no longer a place of adventure. It was a tomb, and they were its prisoners. The jungle was silent now, its oppressive weight pressing down on the few remaining survivors of the ill-fated expedition. Only Chris and two others, Mark and Sarah, remained. The others were gone, lost to the curse that had been awakened in the heart of the forgotten village. Each of them had fallen victim to the relentless pursuit of the Black Widow. Each death had been a reminder of the spirit's power, an unstoppable force of nature that had waited centuries to reclaim its due. As they sat huddled by the dying embers of a fire, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and terror, Chris knew they couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere left to go. The jungle, the very land they had come to explore, had turned against them. It had swallowed them whole, trapping them in a nightmare they could not escape. And the Black Widow, she was always there, watching, waiting for the next moment to strike. "I don't know how much longer we can last," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her eyes were hollow, and her once determined expression had been replaced by one of resignation. She had seen her colleagues torn apart, their bodies left in the wake of the Black Widow's wrath, and she knew deep down that she was next. Mark, ever the skeptic, had no more answers to give. His usual sarcasm had turned to silence. The man who had once dismissed every supernatural tale as mere fiction now sat, staring into the fire, knowing that they were caught in something far darker than he had ever believed possible. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop to their adventure. It was the prison they had stumbled into, and the Black Widow, the very spirit they had unwittingly awakened, was its warden. Chris's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop her. There had to be a way to end this nightmare before it consumed them all. He had studied every ancient culture, every cursed land, and yet nothing had prepared him for the reality of what they faced now. The Black Widow wasn't just a spirit of vengeance. She was something older, something tied to the very land itself. Her curse had been sealed in the heart of the village, in that shrine where the twisted spider carvings had once served as offerings to the dark forces she embodied. And now, the curse had awakened, and there was only one way to end it. "We have to go back," Chris said, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and dread. Mark and Sarah looked at him, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Back?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "To the shrine? Are you crazy? She'll kill us all." "I know," Chris replied, his voice firm, "but it's the only way. If we destroy the heart of the village, the shrine, the altar where the curse began, we can break it. We can stop her." Mark stood up, shaking his head. "And if we fail? If we go back and she kills us all, what then? Is there really any hope left?" Chris's eyes met his. There's no other choice. The decision was made, and with heavy hearts and no other options, the trio gathered their weapons, their fire, and whatever they could carry. They moved swiftly through the jungle, the night air cold and oppressive. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, sent their nerves on edge. They knew the Black Widow was near. She always was. The village, once a place of haunting mystery, now felt like a graveyard. The trees surrounding it loomed like silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded. The air was thick, alive with the curse that had been unleashed, and the ground beneath their feet pulsed with unnatural energy. As they neared the shrine once more, the familiar sense of dread returned, stronger now than ever before. The altar stood before them, still as it had been when they first found it. The spider carvings on the stone were darker now, more menacing, as though the Black Widow's presence had infused them with even greater power. The ground around the shrine was blackened, scorched as if some unseen force had burned it. The chill in the air grew colder, and Chris could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on them. "We need to destroy it," Chris said, his voice trembling with the urgency of the moment. He stepped forward, holding a torch in his hand. "This is the heart of it all." Sarah stepped beside him, her face pale but determined. Mark, too, joined them, though his hands shook as he held a knife, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of the Black Widow. As they began to approach the altar, the air grew even colder. It felt as though the earth itself was resisting their efforts, pushing back against their intrusion. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the sky above seemed to darken. Then the whispers began. Low, guttural, like the rustling of 1,000 spiders crawling beneath the surface of the earth. They were coming. Chris turned to Mark and Sarah. "We can't waste any more time. We have to burn it." With a trembling hand, Chris held the torch to the spider carvings on the altar. As the flames touched the stone, a loud crack split the air, and the earth seemed to groan in agony. The fire spread quickly, consuming the carvings, the smoke rising like a black cloud into the night. But as the flames licked at the altar, the ground shook violently. The jungle itself seemed to roar with fury, and the Black Widow appeared. She was no longer a shadow in the distance, no longer a mere figure. She was there, in front of them, her form towering over them like a nightmare made flesh. Her limbs stretched out unnaturally, her long arms reaching down to the earth, her eyes glowing with a fierce red fire. Her presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The Black Widow was more than just a spirit now. She was the very embodiment of the curse, of vengeance, and of death. Chris and Sarah backed away, but Mark stood frozen, staring at the Black Widow in terror. She moved with unnatural speed, her long limbs snapping like the branches of a tree in the wind. With each step, the ground quaked, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. Her whispers filled their minds, urging them to surrender, to accept their fate. "You can't stop me," the Black Widow's voice echoed in their heads. "The curse cannot be broken. It is eternal. You are mine." In that moment, Chris realized the truth. The curse wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about punishing the village's inhabitants. The Black Widow was the land itself, a manifestation of its ancient, unyielding will. She had been bound to the earth for centuries, and she would never let go. The village had been her prison, and now it was her domain once again. No one, not even Chris and his team, could hope to defeat her. With one final, furious scream, the Black Widow lunged toward them, her body stretching impossibly long, her sharp, venomous fangs glinting in the firelight. Chris and Sarah turned to run, but it was too late. In a single, swift motion, the Black Widow was upon them. Chris's last thought, as he fell to the ground, was that he had failed. The curse was real, and there was no escaping it. The Black Widow had claimed her revenge, and the land would remain forever cursed. The village fell silent once more, the jungle once again swallowing the remnants of the Black Widow's wrath. But the curse remained, deep beneath the soil of Brazil. It was waiting for its next victims. And if you listened closely on a quiet night, you might just hear the whispers of the Black Widow calling from the depths of the earth, waiting to awaken once again.